Hi, welcome to the second online lecture for this rest of the semester. Um, this for this lecture, I'm going to actually split it up into three different segments. Right, the first segment's going to talk about the nuclear arms race and the space race. The second video I'm going to post is going to deal with McCarthyism and what's happening on the U.S. home front. And the third video is going to go over decolonization and what's happening around the world and the United States' responses to that. All right, so for this lecture, we're going to talk about the arms race and the space race, which are two very essential parts of the Cold War. Really, when we think of the Cold War, we talk about that part of the reason why it's cold was because the Soviet Union and the United States never actually declared war on each other, right? We never shot nuclear missiles over to the Soviet Union, and therefore the Cold War remained cold. But then again, talking about our last lectures, we talked about in many areas of the world, the Cold War did get hot, and these proxy wars like Vietnam and Korea. But for our purposes for this lecture, we'll solely talk about the space race and the arms race because they were, in fact, in the news and stuff, the cornerstones of this period of the Cold War. The the question for today is going to deal with describe America's attitudes to communism on the home front and the major social movements that took place in the U.S. because of it, right? So that's talking about what's happening basically on the American home front. And these ID terms I've listed here are going to help you go through and answer those questions. So the world was never the same after the United States leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 with the atomic bombs. Not only had perhaps 180,000 civilians died because of this, but the nature of warfare itself was changed forever. The Soviets, they had their own spies within the Manhattan Project, so they knew the U.S. was developing its atomic bomb. And after the war ended, the U.S. Sort of believed that the Soviet Union wouldn't be able to develop its own nuclear bombs until years, possibly even decades. They thought the Soviet Union was so far behind. But Soviet scientists successfully tested the atomic bomb on August 29, 1949, years before the American officials had estimated they would get it. Soviets got the atomic bomb, and this alarmed the Western world, and particularly the United States, resulting in a nuclear arms race and an increase in military spending on both sides. And remember, I told you that the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, their alliance sort of just deteriorated overnight within a very short period after World War II ended. And because of that, we see a buildup of nuclear bombs on both sides. Remember, I said that in our last lecture that the Cold War was like this global chess match between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was a series of moves and counter moves, right? One side did one thing, the other side either did the opposite or tried to do the same thing better, you know. And in the case of the arms race, the United States, they would develop its new bombs, and the Soviet Union, they would try to surpass the destructive power of these bombs. On November 1st, 1952, the United States denoted the first thermonuclear weapon, or hydrogen bomb, which itself, the hydrogen bomb was far more, multiple times more destructive than the bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I don't know the science behind it, but they use some sort of they use nuclear fusion, I believe, which then creates more of a explosion. So nuclear bombs, it sort of changed the game, right? It made bombs that are even far more destructive than the bomb used in World War II. The blast measured over 10 megatons and generated an inferno 5 miles wide, with a mushroom cloud 25 miles wide and hundreds of miles across. And keep in mind with atomic bombs, whenever they're dropped, it's not only the destructive power of the bomb itself, right? It's not just the fire, the blast radius, but also the atomic radiation, right? The fallout that occurs. The fallout within it, the nuclear radiation within the smoke cloud itself can get carried hundreds of miles away. So the atomic bomb is a very destructive weapon. And in response, the USSR successfully tested its hydrogen bomb in 1953. So just only a year later, after the U.S. developed its atomic hydrogen bomb. Soon after, Eisenhower announced the policy of massive retaliation. So, so if the Soviet Union ever lost its missiles against the U.S. promised that it would launch its nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union. And this changed warfare forever. That both sides then would be theoretically deterred from starting war through the logic of mutually assured destruction. So this acronym MAD, mutually assured destruction, it's basically saying that if one side attacks the other side, that would essentially mean the end of the world. And most people like living in the world, so as a way to deter a nuclear war from ever happening, both sides believed that it was their duty to build up as many nuclear weapons as possible, right? Trying to one up each other, so serve as a deterrent for ever using those weapons in the first place. You would think it'd be a little counterintuitive to be like, okay, well, let's create more weapons so we don't have to have war. But that's really the cornerstone of why the Cold War never really got hot, right? This idea of mutually assured destruction. Both sides like living, right? And in order to not destroy the world, essentially, both sides agreed, like, okay, we'll build up all these nuclear weapons, but we'll never really use them. So fears of nuclear war produced uh, very several films inspired by nuclear weapons. Films such as Godzilla. Godzilla itself, he was like a lizard or whatever that was irradiated because of nuclear testing or whatever, right? And then he went to destroy Tokyo. That's basically the premise of the original Godzilla. But also there was On the Beach, Failsafe. Failsafe's a very good movie. I encourage you to watch that if you can. Also, Doctor Strangelove is another good movie. The premise of Failsafe is, I believe there's a U.S. plane, right, which has a nuclear weapon attached to it, and it would go over to the border of the Soviet Union. And if they didn't receive a message to turn around, then their mission was to go into the Soviet Union and bomb Moscow. So the premise of the movie is the um, the pilot of the airplane with the atomic weapon never got the message to turn around. So he goes into the Soviet Union and he's on this mission that he's going to carry out to blow up the Soviet Union. And this results with like the president going on the phone saying like, "Hey, turn around." And he's like, "No, I got past this point. I can't turn around." And then it results in this Soviet Union getting bombed, but also the United States getting bombed. It's a pretty good movie. It's a little older, but I encourage you to watch it. Also, Doctor Strangelove. I think Failsafe and Doctor Strangelove are on Hulu. So if you have Hulu, I encourage you to watch it. It's a really cool Cold War film that will give you some context into to some of the anxieties that are going on because of the arms race at this time. So nuclear technology was at the center of this debate during the Cold War. In 1953, President Eisenhower gave his Atoms for Peace speech, in which he proclaimed that the U.S. should share its knowledge of atomic energy with their allies. This speech brought about the establishment of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, along with worldwide investment in this new economic sector. And because of this, we start to see other countries getting atomic energy, right? Nuclear power plants, which nuclear power plants themselves. My dad used to work in one. He said that they produce far more electricity than coal plants or hydroelectric plants or anything like that. But the bad thing is you get nuclear radiation, and possibly you could have meltdowns like what happened in Chernobyl in the 80s. So we discussed in our World War II lecture how the United States, after World War II, developed the atomic bomb. The bomb's little man and fat boy dropped on Japan needed to be physically dropped from an airplane, right? There were actual bombs that needed to be dropped. But the problem with planes dropping bombs are just like in the missions over Europe in World War II. There's some missions where 50% of our airplanes were shot down, right? It's very easy to shoot down an airplane. So the U.S. looked for a better way to deliver its nuclear weapons. And in World War II, the Nazis developed a long-range missile called the V-2 missile. The Nazi V-2 missile was capable of delivering an explosive payload up to a distance of nearly 600 miles away. So it could be launched and it could go 600 miles away. And after World War II, both nations sought to capture Nazi scientists for their designs over developing this missile technology. The Nazis were the first to achieve this missile technology, and the Soviets and the U.S. wanted them. And because of that, there were many Nazi scientists who really should have been condemned as being war criminals, who were actually taken up by the Soviet Union and the United States to work for programs like in the U.S., like NASA. NASA had tons of former Nazi scientists working for them, right? So uh, in the interest of American interests, we decided to turn a blind eye to some of these Nazis' actions during the war in order to help us develop this new missile technology. And after the end of the war, the American and Soviet rocket engineering teams worked to adapt German technology in order to create intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. Um, so the Soviets achieved this first. They even used the same launch vehicle used for missiles on October 4th, 1957, to send uh, Sputnik, the first human-made satellite, into orbit. So Sputnik was sort of like the first satellite that humans ever launched into orbit. It's a huge feat. Um, but the issue is the Soviets did this first, and many Americans were actually freaked out because of this. There was a good movie that was made, I think in the 90s, and it's called October Sky. I encourage you to watch it. It's about this like high schooler or whatever who sees Sputnik being launched into space in the 50s, and he decides to build his own rockets, and then he eventually becomes part of he becomes a NASA scientist. It's a pretty good movie, but in that movie, it sort of shows the fears that many Americans had after Sputnik was launched. Right? It was supposed to just be like a satellite used for like radio, whatever, for the Soviet Union. But many Americans thought that Sputnik itself had like photographic technology that was spying on Americans at all times, and this freaked out many Americans. In response, the U.S. government rushed to perfect its own ICBM technology and launch its own satellites and astronauts into space. In 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was created. Uh, and then at first, Americans' attempts to launch satellites into orbit using the Vanguard rocket suffered spectacular failures, heightening fears of Soviet domination in space. American anxieties were that they were falling behind in the space race, and they needed to sort of outpace the Soviet Union. Remember that this is a competition to show who was more technologically advanced, which system was better, the US or the Soviet Union. So in September 13th, 1959, when the Soviet Union launched its Luna 2 capsule, which became the first human-made object to touch the moon, uh, this really became a sign that the US was falling behind in the space race. Then the Soviet Union successfully launched a pair of dogs, Belka and Strelka, which became the first living things in space. But don't worry, those two dogs, I've been informed that they actually did make it back home and stuff. So they didn't just like go off into space and never returned. Um, and despite countless failures and one massive accident that killed nearly 100 Soviet military and rocket engineers, the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was launched into orbit in April 12th of 1961. So the Soviets were the first people to actually send a person into space, which was a huge deal. But then on May 7th, 1961, the U.S. managed to send its first astronaut into space. But it was apparent that they were still months behind Soviet technology. And then, whenever JFK became the president of the United States, he would use the America's losses in the space race to bolster funding towards NASA, and eventually that's why the United States was able to make it to the moon first. The whole moon landing was actually a part of this huge space race between the United States and Soviet Union. These things are all connected. Like I said before, the Cold War was this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. Each side tried to just one up each other. In recent years, the the national funding for NASA has actually plummeted. NASA hasn't received as much funding as in the past. And part of the reason why this happened is because the United States doesn't have a competitor like the Soviet Union anymore. They don't necessarily see the need to try to advance space technology as fast as they did during the Cold War. And because of that, NASA is sort of falling behind in that respect. But we see privatized companies like Tesla, Elon Musk trying to advance its own space technology for its own purposes, making a habitat on Mars or something like that. But the so we see this shift between a nationally funded administration like NASA to more privatized companies now, because the United States doesn't feel this need to compete with anyone anymore. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. So all these things are connected. The space race and the nuclear arms race, as we see, they sort of worked hand in hand. Nazi missile technology was applied to the atomic weapons, creating ICBMs, but also this rocket technology is also connected to the development of space technology, right? Sending people and things and satellites into space. And a big reason why rockets were so important was because, especially with ICBMs, rockets are incredibly hard to shoot down. They could be launched on the other side of the planet, right? Missile fields in the Midwest that were created at this time had the ballistic missile range of going all the way to the Soviet Union. And this buildup of the nuclear arms race caused tons of panic. In the early 1950s, the Federal Civil Defense Administration began preparing its citizens for the worst. School children were instructed via the film featuring Bert the Turtle to duck and cover. So in here we could see a picture of Bert the Turtle. He says, Bert ducks and covers. He's smart, but he uses shelter on his back. You must learn to find shelter. So basically, this duck and cover instruction was that if a nuclear strike was ever to happen, students were supposed to go under their desk and sort of crawl and take cover. I'm not sure what ducking under a desk would do against a nuclear attack, but maybe it's just to help make students calm in case this was happening. I mean, having some extra cover over your head wouldn't be that bad of an idea, but I don't know how. I mean, if you're like in a city center, right, where that attack happened, I don't know how good hiding under a desk would do. But these drills were very real. I mean, just like in public schools today, we have inclement weather drills, we have tornado drills, fire drills. I mean, my parents and they went to school in the 70s and 80s, and they clearly remember doing duck and cover drills, just like any other weather or fire drill. It was just a normal part of their life. But it's crazy that the 80s wasn't that far removed from us. The Soviet Union itself didn't collapse until 91. So many of our parents' generations, they lived through this fear up until the 80s that a nuclear threat was could happen, and in some respects were pretty likely to happen. So these things were very real to millions of Americans and many people around the world. Thankfully, the strategy of mutually assured destruction, MAD, helped to prevent or deter a nuclear war from ever happening. Even when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, one of the closest points that we ever got to nuclear warfare, both sides decided that it wasn't worth it to blow each other to hell, and that they need to back off, that these nuclear weapons cannot be used against each other, because if they were ever used, it would mean the end of the world. All right, so this was part one of our lecture for today about the nuclear arms race, the development of that, but also the space race and how these two things are hand in hand with each other, that they're intertwined, and as one side's technology got better, the other side felt a need to try to one up them as well. So part two of this lecture will cover the Cold War's impact on American society and what's happening in America at this time. All right, so stay tuned for part two of this lecture. I figured that breaking up these lectures would probably be more digestible for you, right? So you don't just have to hear my voice for an hour straight, that you could pause it and view it whenever you would like. All right, so I will post the second video along with this, so I encourage you to watch that video as well. Thank you.